3 children, 1 desperate mother, and a man who thought he'd live alone forever. In the brutal winter of 1887, when the Colorado Territory was nothing but frozen wilderness and broken dreams, fate had a way of bringing together the most unlikely families. Sometimes salvation came wrapped in a blizzard. Sometimes love arrived with frost-bitten fingers and empty stomachs. This is the story of how a woman running from her past collided with a man hiding from his future. How 3 hungry children taught a lonely soul what home really meant. And how sometimes the family you choose becomes stronger than the one you're born into. But every great love story begins with desperation. Every true family starts with strangers. And every miracle begins with someone willing to open their door when the world has slammed theirs shut. So settle in, because tonight we're heading deep into the Colorado mountains, where the snow falls like judgment and mercy comes wearing work boots and carrying an axe. The wind screamed across the Rocky Mountain peaks like a banshee looking for souls to claim. It was the kind of blizzard that old-timers talked about for decades afterward, the kind that rewrote maps and made widows out of wives. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see your hands stretched out in front of your face, and the cold cut through wool and leather like it was tissue paper. Thomas Brennan stood at his cabin window, watching the white wall of death advance across his property. He'd been living alone in these mountains for 7 years now, ever since everything went to hell back in Denver. 7 years of solitude, 7 years of nothing but the sound of his own axe biting into timber and his own voice talking to the wind. At 42, Thomas had the kind of face that spoke of hard winters and harder choices. His beard was streaked with silver, his hands scarred from countless hours working with rough timber, and his eyes held the particular weariness that comes from carrying guilt like a stone in your chest. He was tall, 6'3" in his stocking feet, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world, though he'd settled for carrying just his own sins. The cabin he'd built with his own hands was solid enough to weather any storm. Thick log walls, a stone chimney that drew clean, and enough firewood stacked under the eaves to last until spring. He had venison hanging in his smokehouse, beans and flour in his pantry, and a well that never ran dry. Everything a man needed to survive alone. And Thomas Brennan had been surviving alone just fine, thank you very much. The storm had been building for 3 days, but this morning it had turned vicious. Thomas had spent the early hours bringing in extra firewood and checking on his small stable where his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Delilah, waited out the weather. Now there was nothing to do but wait and listen to the wind try to tear his roof off. He was reaching for his coffee cup when he heard it. At first he thought it was just the wind playing tricks. The sound was so faint, so nearly swallowed by the howling storm, that he almost dismissed it. But there it was again, a sound that had no business being out in weather like this. Crying. A child crying. Thomas set down his cup and moved closer to the window, pressing his ear against the cold glass. The sound came again, closer now, and with it something else. Voices, adult voices, barely audible over the storm. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, grabbing his heavy coat from the peg by the door. He pulled on his boots, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and stepped out onto his porch. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water instantly. The snow was coming down so hard it was like standing inside a cloud. But he could hear them now, definitely voices, and they were coming from the direction of the main trail that led down to Silverton, 20 miles away. No one should be out in this weather. No one with half a brain would try to travel mountain roads in a blizzard like this. But someone was out there, and from the sound of it, they were in trouble. Thomas grabbed the kerosene lantern from his porch and lit it, holding it high as he stepped off the porch and into the storm. The snow was already knee-deep and getting deeper by the minute. He pushed forward, following the sound of the voices, the lantern creating a small circle of yellow light in the endless white. "Hello," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Hello! Follow my voice!" He heard an answering call, a woman's voice, thin and desperate. "Help us, please! I can't see!" Thomas pushed forward, using the lantern like a beacon. His beard was already coated with ice, and his fingers were going numb despite his gloves. If whoever was out there had been walking in this for any length of time, they were probably close to death. Then he saw them, A woman emerged from the swirling snow like a ghost, her dark hair plastered to her head with ice, her face so pale it was nearly blue. She was carrying something. No, someone. A small child, wrapped in what looked like a blanket, completely limp in her arms. Behind her came two more figures, children stumbling through the snow and clinging to each other. The woman saw his lantern and let out a sob of relief. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "My children. We've been walking since, I don't know how long. Our wagon, the wheel broke, and the horses." She collapsed to her knees in the snow, still clutching the small child. Thomas was beside her in an instant, taking the bundle from her arms. It was a little girl, maybe 4 years old, her lips blue with cold and her breathing shallow. "How many?" he asked, lifting the woman to her feet. "3," she managed. "3 children. They're so cold they can't—" "Follow me," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the wind like a command. "Stay close. Hold on to my coat if you have to." He turned and began pushing back through the snow toward his cabin, the lantern held high in one hand, the unconscious child cradled in his other arm. Behind him, he could hear the woman urging the other children forward, her voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. The walk back to the cabin felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. When the yellow glow of his windows finally appeared through the storm, Thomas felt a relief so profound it surprised him. He kicked open his door and stepped inside, immediately setting the little girl down on his couch near the fireplace. The woman stumbled in behind him with the other 2 children, a boy who looked to be maybe 8 and another girl around 6. All of them were soaked to the skin and shaking violently. "Get out of those wet clothes," Thomas said, already moving toward his bedroom. "All of you. Everything wet needs to come off now." He returned with an armful of quilts and blankets, his spare clothes, anything dry and warm he could find. The woman was trying to undress the children with fingers so stiff with cold she could barely work the buttons. "Let me," Thomas said gently, kneeling beside the unconscious little girl. With practiced efficiency, he stripped off her wet clothes and wrapped her in one of his flannel shirts, then bundled her in quilts. Her skin was like ice, but she was breathing. The woman was struggling with her own coat, her whole body shaking so hard she couldn't manage the clasps. Without thinking, Thomas moved to help her, his fingers working the frozen buckles, while she stood there swaying on her feet. "Thank you," she whispered. I thought we were going to die out there." "You might have," Thomas said bluntly, helping her out of her coat. "How long were you walking?" "Since this morning. Maybe longer." Time stopped meaning anything. She was wearing a simple dress underneath the coat, soaked through and clinging to her frame. She was thin, too thin, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of more than just one hard day. This woman had been struggling for a while. "There's a clean shirt and pants on the chair," Thomas said, turning away to give her privacy. "Get changed and get close to the fire. I'll make coffee." As he busied himself with the coffee pot, he could hear her moving around behind him, the rustle of wet fabric being discarded and dry clothes being pulled on. The children were huddled together on his couch, wrapped in quilts and slowly beginning to warm up. The little girl's eyes had fluttered open, and she was looking around with the confused expression of a child waking up in a strange place. When Thomas turned back around, the woman had changed into his spare clothes, a flannel shirt that was far too big for her, and a pair of work pants she'd had to roll up at the cuffs. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, still damp but no longer dripping ice. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. Not in the polished way of city women, but with the kind of natural grace that comes from strength and determination. "I'm Thomas," he said, offering her a cup of coffee. "Thomas Brennan." "Mary," she replied, accepting the cup with grateful hands. "Mary Caldwell. And these are my children, Emma, Samuel, and little Grace." She nodded toward each child in turn. Emma was the oldest, maybe 8, with her mother's dark hair and serious eyes. Samuel looked to be around 6, with freckles and the kind of bright curiosity that even exhaustion couldn't dim. And Grace, the little one who'd been unconscious, was maybe 4, with blonde curls and big blue eyes that were now fixed on Thomas with the frank stare that only small children can manage. "You saved our lives," Mary said quietly. "I don't know how to thank you." Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. You eat venison? We eat anything, Mary said with a rueful smile. We haven't had a proper meal in, well, it's been a while. As Thomas moved around his small kitchen, preparing a meal from his stores, he found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guests. The children were starting to come back to life as they warmed up, whispering among themselves and looking around his cabin with wide eyes. It had been so long since there had been other voices in this space, so long since the silence had been broken by anything other than the wind. Where were you headed? He asked as he sliced venison for the pan. Mary's face clouded. Silverton. My husband, my late husband, had a brother there. I hoped he might help us. Late husband, Thomas repeated gently. He died 6 months ago. Fever took him. Mary's voice was steady, but Thomas could hear the carefully controlled grief underneath. We lost the farm after that. Couldn't keep up with the payments. I thought James, my brother-in-law, I thought maybe he'd help us start over. Long way to travel in winter, Thomas observed. We didn't have much choice. Mary looked down at her coffee cup. The bank was going to put us out anyway. I figured we could make it to Silverton before the snow got bad. What happened to your wagon? Hit a hole in the road about 5 miles back. Broke the axle. The horses spooked in the storm and ran off. She looked up at him. We started walking because staying with the wagon meant freezing to death. Thomas nodded, understanding. She'd made the right choice, even if it had nearly killed them all. 5 miles in a blizzard with 3 children. It was a miracle they'd made it to his door. Mama, little Grace said suddenly, her voice small and tired. I'm hungry. I know, sweetheart, Mary said, smoothing the child's hair. Mr. Brennan is making us food. Thomas looked over at the family huddled around his fireplace and felt something twist in his chest. Something he'd thought was dead and buried. They looked so small, so fragile, so completely dependent on his kindness. 7 years he'd been alone. 7 years of telling himself he was better off without the complications of other people. 7 years of believing that a man like him, a man who'd failed when it mattered most, had no business being responsible for anyone else. But here they were, 3 children and their mother, brought to his door by the storm. And despite everything he'd told himself about the virtues of solitude, Thomas Brennan found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, the mountain silence had been getting a little too quiet. Tell you what, he said, turning back to his cooking. This storm's not going to let up for days. You're welcome to stay until it passes. Mary looked up at him with surprise and something that might have been hope. We couldn't impose. You're not imposing, Thomas said firmly. You're surviving. There's a difference. As he continued preparing the meal, Thomas found himself wondering what exactly he'd just committed to. He'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten how to share space with other people. But looking at those 3 children, remembering the desperate sound of Mary's voice in the storm, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and the snow continued to fall. But inside Thomas Brennan's cabin, for the first time in 7 years, the silence was broken by something other than solitude. It was broken by the sound of family. The morning came gray and quiet, with that peculiar hush that follows a heavy snowfall. Thomas woke to the unfamiliar sound of children's voices and realized with a start that the previous day hadn't been a dream. There really were 4 strangers sleeping in his cabin. He'd given up his bedroom to Mary and the children, making himself a bed on the floor near the fireplace. It wasn't the most comfortable night he'd ever spent, but it was far from the worst. He'd slept in worse places during his years of wandering before he'd settled in these mountains. Thomas dressed quietly and stepped outside to assess the damage from the storm. The world was buried under more than 3 feet of snow, and it was still falling, though gently now. His woodpile was half buried, and the path to his stable was completely obliterated. It would take hours to dig out, and that was assuming the storm stopped soon. Delilah nickered a greeting when he pushed open the stable door, and he spent a few minutes checking on her and making sure she had enough feed and water. The stable was solid, built to withstand mountain winters, and she'd weathered the storm just fine. When he returned to the cabin, he found Mary already up, standing by the window and looking out at the snow with an expression he couldn't quite read. Coffee's on the stove, he said quietly, not wanting to wake the children. Thank you. She turned to face him, and in the morning light, he could see the full extent of her exhaustion. There were deep circles under her eyes, and her clothes, his clothes, hung loose on her thin frame. I've been thinking, we need to talk about what happens next. Thomas poured coffee for both of them and gestured toward the kitchen table. They sat across from each other, the morning light casting long shadows across the rough wooden surface. I know you said we could stay until the storm passes, Mary began, but I need you to understand, we don't have anything to pay you with. No money, no goods to trade. I can't even promise we'll be able to repay your kindness. I didn't ask for payment, Thomas said simply, but you should expect it. Mary's voice was firm, despite her obvious fatigue. I won't be a charity case, Mr. Brennan. I won't have my children thinking they can take without giving back. Thomas studied her face, noting the stubborn set of her jaw, the pride that straightened her shoulders despite her circumstances. He recognized that pride. He'd worn it himself often enough. What kind of work can you do? He asked. Mary blinked, clearly surprised by the question. Work? You said you don't want charity. Fair enough. But this storm's likely to last another day or two, maybe more. If you're staying, you might as well be useful. A small smile tugged at the corner of Mary's mouth. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I kept house for my husband and managed our farm. I'm not afraid of hard work. And the children? Emma's old enough to help with simple chores. Samuel's good with animals. He had a way with our chickens back home. And Grace, ... Mary's expression softened. Grace is 4. She's good at being 4. Thomas found himself almost smiling at that. Being 4 is a full-time job. The hardest job there is, Mary agreed. They were interrupted by the sound of small feet padding across the cabin floor. Grace appeared in the doorway, still wrapped in one of Thomas's flannel shirts like a tiny tent, her blonde curls sticking up in all directions. Mama, she said in a small voice, I'm hungry, and I have to use the privy. The privy's probably buried under 3 feet of snow, Thomas said, getting up from the table. There's a chamber pot under the bed, and I'll get breakfast started. As Mary dealt with Grace's immediate needs, Thomas began preparing breakfast. More venison, some of his precious remaining eggs from the chickens he kept in the stable, and pancakes made from his dwindling supply of flour. It had been years since he'd cooked for anyone but himself, and he found himself taking extra care with the meal. Emma and Samuel emerged as the smell of food filled the cabin. They were wearing Thomas's clothes too. Emma in one of his shirts that reached her knees. Samuel swimming in a pair of work pants he'd had to tie around his waist with rope. They looked like children playing dress up, but there was nothing playful about the hunger in their eyes. Good morning, Emma said politely, though she stayed close to her mother's side. Samuel was less reserved. He walked right up to Thomas and studied him with the frank curiosity of a 6-year-old. Are you a mountain man? Samuel asked. Samuel, Mary warned, but Thomas held up a hand. I guess I am, Thomas said seriously. I live in the mountains and I'm a man. What does that make you? Samuel considered this. I don't know yet. Maybe a mountain boy? Could be, Thomas agreed. You'll have to earn the title, though. How? Thomas handed him a plate of food. Start by eating everything on this plate. Mountain boys need their strength. Samuel took the plate with both hands and nodded solemnly, as if he'd just been given an important mission. Breakfast was a quieter affair than Thomas was used to. The children ate with the focused intensity of those who'd been truly hungry, and Mary watched them with the careful eye of a mother making sure her babies got enough. Thomas found himself eating less than usual, making sure there was plenty for his guests. Mr. Brennan, Emma said when she'd finished eating, where do you sleep? Emma, Mary said quickly. That's not polite. It's all right, Thomas said. I slept by the fire last night. It was warm enough? Emma frowned. But it's your house. We shouldn't take your bed. Thomas looked at this serious little girl and felt something stir in his chest. She was worried about him, this child who'd nearly frozen to death just yesterday. A man's bed is just a place to sleep, he said gently. But a warm fire can save lives. I think I got the better deal. After breakfast, Thomas set about organizing the work that needed to be done. The storm was still falling, though lighter now, and he needed to dig out paths to the stable and the woodpile. Mary insisted on helping, despite his protests. "I meant what I said about earning our keep," she said, pulling on his spare coat. "If we're staying, we're working." She proved to be as capable as she'd claimed. While Thomas shoveled the heavy snow, Mary worked behind him, widening the paths and making them stable. Emma helped by carrying wood from the pile to the cabin, and Samuel proved his worth by helping Thomas tend to Delilah and the chickens. Grace, meanwhile, appointed herself supervisor of the entire operation, standing on the porch wrapped in blankets and offering commentary on everyone's work. "Mama, you're not digging deep enough," she called out. "Mr. Thomas, that log is too big for Emma." "Yes, ma'am," Thomas called back, which made Grace giggle. By midday, they had paths cleared and enough wood brought in to last another few days. Thomas found himself impressed by Mary's stamina and the children's willingness to help. They worked like a family that was used to pulling together in hard times. "All right," he said when they had finished. "I think we've earned some lunch." As they sat around his table eating bread and venison stew, Thomas realized something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. It no longer felt like a space where strangers were imposing on his solitude. It felt like, well, it felt like a home where a family lived. "Mr. Brennan," Mary said as they finished eating, "I need to ask you something." "What's that?" "How long have you been alone up here?" Thomas set down his coffee cup, considering the question. 7 years. That's a long time to be by yourself. I prefer it that way." Mary studied his face. "Do you? Really?" It was a simple question, but it hit Thomas harder than he'd expected. Did he prefer being alone? He'd told himself he did for so long that he'd almost believed it. But sitting here now, listening to Samuel tell Emma about the chickens, watching Grace trying to stack her remaining bread into a tiny house, seeing Mary's quiet smile as she watched her children, he wasn't so sure anymore. "I thought I did," he said finally. "What changed your mind?" Thomas looked around the table at these 4 people who'd stumbled into his life in the middle of a blizzard. "Maybe I just forgot what the alternative felt like." That afternoon, while the storm continued to blow outside, something remarkable happened in Thomas Brennan's cabin. The careful politeness between strangers began to give way to something warmer, more natural. Mary found Thomas's small collection of books and began reading to the children by the fire. Her voice was soft and musical, and Thomas found himself stopping his work just to listen. Emma and Samuel sat on either side of their mother, following along with the words, while Grace curled up in Mary's lap and fought sleep. "Do you have children, Mr. Brennan?" Emma asked during a break in the reading. The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. For a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Old grief rose in his throat, threatening to choke him. "Emma," Mary said quickly, sensing his distress, "that's a personal question." "I had a son," Thomas said quietly, "a long time ago." "Where is he now?" Samuel asked with a child's innocent curiosity. "He died," Thomas said simply. "He and his mother, both." The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Emma and Samuel exchanged glances, and Grace looked up at Thomas with big solemn eyes. "I'm sorry," Emma said softly. "Me too," Samuel added. Grace didn't say anything, but she climbed down from her mother's lap and walked over to Thomas. Without a word, she climbed onto his knee and patted his cheek with her small hand. "It's okay to be sad," she said with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a 4-year-old. "Mama cries sometimes about Papa, but she says he's still with us in here." She patted her chest, over her heart. Thomas felt his throat close up entirely. When was the last time someone had tried to comfort him? When was the last time anyone had cared enough about his pain to acknowledge it? "Thank you, Grace," he managed. That evening, as the storm finally began to weaken, Thomas found himself reluctant to think about it ending. When the snow stopped, Mary and the children would continue on to Silverton. They'd find her brother-in-law, make a new life, and become a memory of the brief time when his cabin had been filled with voices and laughter. The thought bothered him more than it should have. "You don't have to go," he said suddenly as Mary was tucking the children into bed. She looked up, surprised. "What?" "To Silverton." "You don't have to go to Silverton." Mary straightened slowly. "Mr. Brennan?" "Thomas. Call me Thomas." "Thomas." She moved away from the children, lowering her voice. We can't stay here. You know that. Why not? Because, Mary struggled for words, because this isn't our home. Because you've been alone for 7 years and you're probably used to it. Because we'd be in your way. What if you wouldn't be? Mary stared at him. What are you saying? Thomas looked around his cabin, at the children's small faces in the lamplight, at the dishes on the table that showed evidence of a family meal, at the warmth and life that filled spaces that had been cold and empty for so long. I'm saying that maybe I was wrong about preferring to be alone, he said. I'm saying that maybe this storm brought me exactly what I needed, even if I didn't know I needed it. Thomas, Mary's voice was soft, uncertain. I'm not asking for anything you can't give, Thomas said quickly. I'm not asking for promises or anything like that. I'm just saying you have a place here, if you want it. All of you. Mary was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas held his breath, waiting. The children need stability, she said finally. They need a real home, not just charity from a kind stranger. Then let's make it a real home, Thomas said. Let's make it family. Outside, the storm was finally breaking. Through the window, Thomas could see patches of clear sky appearing between the clouds. But inside his cabin, another kind of storm was just beginning. The kind that changes everything. The kind that takes strangers and makes them family. The kind that proves that sometimes the best things in life come wrapped in blizzards and delivered by fate. Mary looked at him for a long moment, and Thomas saw something shift in her eyes. Something that looked like hope. We'd earn our keep, she said quietly. I wouldn't expect anything else. And the children, they'd need to understand that this isn't temporary. If we stay, we stay. I won't have them getting attached and then losing another home. If you stay, Thomas said, this will be home, for as long as you want it to be. Mary nodded slowly. Then I guess we should talk about what happens next. As they sat down to plan their future together, Thomas realized that 7 years of solitude had just ended, not with a whimper, but with the sound of children's laughter and a woman's gentle voice reading stories by the fire. He'd thought he was rescuing them from the storm. It turned out they'd been rescuing him. 2 weeks after the storm, Thomas Brennan's carefully ordered life had been turned completely upside down, and he was surprised to discover he didn't mind one bit. The cabin that had once been a monument to solitude now buzzed with constant activity. Emma had claimed a corner near the window for her school, where she practiced her letters and taught Grace to write her name. Samuel had appointed himself Thomas's assistant in all matters relating to the care and feeding of animals, and took his responsibility so seriously that Thomas had taken to consulting him before making any decisions about the chickens or Delilah. And Mary had transformed the cabin from a place where a man survived into a place where a family lived. She'd reorganized his kitchen with an efficiency that was both impressive and slightly intimidating. She'd mended his clothes, patched holes in his walls he hadn't even noticed, and somehow managed to make his simple meals taste better than they ever had when he'd cooked them himself. More than that, she'd brought something to the cabin that Thomas had forgotten existed: contentment. Thomas, Mary said on a bright morning when the sun made the snow-covered mountains look like something out of a fairy tale, we need to talk about supplies. Thomas looked up from where he was teaching Samuel how to properly sharpen an axe blade. What kind of supplies? Food, mostly. And clothes for the children. They can't wear your shirts forever, even if Grace thinks it makes her look like a mountain princess. Grace, who was indeed wearing one of Thomas's shirts as a dress, looked up from where she was building a snow fort on the porch. I am a mountain princess, she announced with 4-year-old certainty. Of course you are, Thomas said solemnly, which made Grace beam with pride. Mary smiled, but her expression remained practical. The thing is, we'll need to go to town soon. Silverton's the closest, and I still need to contact James, my brother-in-law. He needs to know we're all right. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the winter air. You thinking about going to live with him? No, Mary said quickly, then paused. At least I don't think so. But I need to talk to him. There might be things of my husband's, papers or, I don't know, things that belong to the children. When do you want to go? Mary looked around at the children, at the mountains, at the cabin that had become their sanctuary. Soon, I guess. But Thomas, I want you to come with us. All of us. All of us. Mary's voice was firm. We're a family now. We do things together. The word family still caught Thomas off guard every time one of them said it. After 7 years of thinking of himself as a lone wolf, it was taking some adjustment to remember that he was part of something bigger now. All right, he said, but we'll need to take the sled. It's still too much snow for the wagon. 3 days later, they set out for Silverton in Thomas's heavy winter sled, pulled by Delilah and loaded with blankets, food, and enough supplies for several days in town. The children were excited about the adventure, having been cooped up in the cabin for weeks. Even Emma, who was usually the most serious of the three, was chattering about what they might see in town. The trip to Silverton normally took Thomas about 4 hours when he was traveling alone on horseback. With the sled and the snow, it took them most of the day, but it was a beautiful journey, winding through snow-covered forests and past frozen streams that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. Samuel kept up a running commentary on everything they passed, pointing out animal tracks in the snow and asking Thomas questions about every tree, rock, and cloud formation they encountered. Grace spent most of the trip curled up between Thomas and Mary on the sled's front seat, occasionally falling asleep against Thomas's shoulder. Emma was quieter, but Thomas caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. Finally, as they were descending into the valley where Silverton lay, she spoke up. "Thomas," she said, "are you going to marry Mama?" The question was so unexpected that Thomas nearly dropped the reins. Beside him, Mary went very still. "Emma," Mary said, her voice sharp with embarrassment. "That's not... You can't just ask." "Why not?" Emma asked with perfect logic. "You like each other. We're living together like a family. And Susie Peterson back home said that when a man and a woman live together with children, they usually get married." "Susie Peterson doesn't know everything," Mary said, but her cheeks were pink. "Do you want to marry Mama?" Samuel asked, apparently deciding this was a fascinating topic of conversation. "Boys don't marry mamas," Grace said with the authority of someone who had strong opinions about such things. "Boys marry girls. Mamas marry daddies." "Thomas could be our daddy," Samuel pointed out. "I already had a daddy," Grace said, her little brow furrowed with concentration. "But he went to heaven. Mama said so." The conversation was veering into territory that Thomas had no idea how to navigate. He glanced at Mary, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the snow. "Your mama and I are friends," Thomas said carefully. "Good friends. And sometimes good friends live together and take care of each other." "Like family," Emma said. "Like family," Thomas agreed. "But not married family," Samuel said, clearly trying to work through the logic. "There are different kinds of families," Mary said, finally finding her voice. "Some families are married, some aren't. What matters is that people care about each other and take care of each other." "Do you care about us?" Grace asked Thomas. Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Yes," he said quietly. "I care about all of you very much." "Then we're family," Grace announced as if the matter were settled. "And that's good enough for me." Silverton was a bustling mining town, much larger and more chaotic than Thomas's mountain solitude. The streets were crowded with miners, merchants, and the kind of rough characters that gravitated toward boomtowns. Thomas kept the children close as they made their way through the muddy streets to the hotel. Finding James Caldwell turned out to be easier than they'd expected. He owned a hardware store on Main Street and was well known in town. When they asked directions, half a dozen people pointed them toward Caldwell's Mercantile. James Caldwell turned out to be a thin, nervous-looking man in his 30s, with thinning hair and ink-stained fingers. When Mary introduced herself and the children, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and what looked like dismay. "Mary," he said finally, "I thought your letter said you were coming in the fall. That was months ago. I thought something had happened to you." "Something did happen," Mary said. "Our wagon broke down in the mountains during the blizzard. We nearly died. If it hadn't been for Thomas here, we would have." James looked at Thomas with the kind of assessment that made it clear he was trying to figure out exactly what Thomas's relationship to his sister-in-law might be. "I see," James said slowly. "Well, I'm glad you're safe, of course. All of you." He paused, clearly uncomfortable. Mary, could we speak privately? Mary glanced at Thomas, who nodded. Children, stay with Thomas. I'll be right back. As Mary followed James to the back of the store, Thomas kept the children entertained by letting them explore the merchandise. Samuel was fascinated by the tools. Emma studied the books and school supplies, and Grace was enchanted by a display of penny candy. Can we have some? Grace asked, pressing her nose against the glass. We'll ask your mama, Thomas said, but he was already reaching for his coin purse. It had been a long time since he'd had anyone to spoil. After about 10 minutes, Mary returned, and Thomas could tell immediately that the conversation hadn't gone well. Her face was tight, and there was a familiar stubborn set to her jaw. Everything all right? Thomas asked quietly. Fine, Mary said, but her tone suggested it was anything but. James followed her back to the front of the store, looking even more uncomfortable than before. Mr. Brennan, was it? I wonder if I might have a word with you as well. Thomas looked at Mary, who nodded curtly. Emma, watch your brother and sister for a moment. James led Thomas to the same back room, closing the door behind them. The space was cramped, filled with inventory and smelling of dust and metal. Mr. Brennan, James began, I want to thank you for helping my sister-in-law and her children. That was very Christian of you. Thomas waited, sensing there was more coming. The thing is, James continued, Mary's told me about your, arrangement. Living together, I mean. And I have to say, I'm concerned about the propriety of the situation. The propriety, Thomas repeated flatly. Yes, an unmarried woman living with an unmarried man. It's not right. It's not proper. And with children involved. James shook his head. People talk, Mr. Brennan. Mary has a reputation to think about. Thomas felt his temper beginning to rise, but he kept his voice level. Those people weren't there when she and her children were freezing to death in a blizzard. No, of course not. And I'm grateful for what you did. But the emergency is over now. Mary and the children need a proper home, with proper supervision. I've told her they can stay with me and my wife. We have room, and it would be appropriate. And what does Mary say about that? James's expression soured slightly. Mary is being stubborn. She seems to think that what you've built together is some kind of real family. But it's not, is it? It's just a temporary arrangement that got out of hand. Thomas studied James Caldwell's face and saw everything he needed to know about the man. James was the kind of person who cared more about what the neighbors thought than about what was actually best for the people involved. Let me ask you something, Thomas said quietly. In the 6 months since your brother died, how many times have you written to Mary? How many times have you offered to help? James flushed. We weren't sure. The roads in winter. That's what I thought. Thomas stepped closer, and James involuntarily took a step back. You didn't want the responsibility then, but now that she's standing in your store, you're suddenly concerned about propriety. Now see here. No, you see here. Thomas's voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath it. Those children have been through hell. They lost their father, their home, everything they knew. And just when they're starting to feel safe again, starting to trust that they have a family that won't abandon them, you want to tear them away from the only stability they've had? They need proper guidance. They need love, Thomas said flatly. They need people who put their welfare ahead of what the neighbors might say. And if you can't understand that, then you're not the man who should be making decisions about their future. James's face was red now. Are you threatening me? I'm telling you. Thomas opened the door to the back room. Mary and those children are my family now, and I protect my family. When they returned to the front of the store, Mary took one look at Thomas's face and seemed to understand exactly how the conversation had gone. We should go, she said quietly. Children, say goodbye to Uncle James. The goodbyes were polite but strained. As they loaded back into the sled, Thomas could see James watching them through his store window, his expression disapproving. He wanted us to stay with him, Mary said as they drove out of town. I figured. He said it wasn't proper, us living together unmarried. Thomas was quiet for a moment. What do you think? Mary looked back at the children, who were already settling in for the long ride home, then at Thomas. I think, she said carefully, that there's more than one way to make something proper. That evening, as they made camp under the stars halfway home, the children asleep in the back of the sled, Mary and Thomas sat by their small campfire and talked about the future. James offered to let us stay, Mary said. He said he'd provide for us, help the children get proper schooling. But, Mary smiled ruefully, but his wife looked like she'd rather swallow nails than have us move in. And James is the kind of man who does his duty because it's expected, not because he wants to. And what do you want? Mary was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I want what we have, she said finally. I want the children to wake up happy, to go to sleep feeling safe. I want to cook dinner for people who appreciate it, to mend clothes for someone who needs them mended. I want to feel useful, needed, valued. You are all of those things. With you, yes. In your cabin, with your life. Our life. Yes, I am. Mary looked at him across the fire. But James is right about one thing. What we have isn't conventional. People will talk. Let them talk. It's not that simple, Thomas. The children need to be able to hold their heads up in the world. They need to know they belong somewhere, legitimately. Thomas understood what she was saying, and he'd been thinking about it himself. There was a solution, of course, an obvious one, but it would change everything between them, and he wasn't sure either of them was ready for that. Mary, he said carefully, what if we made it legitimate? She looked up sharply. What? Marriage, Thomas said. A real marriage for the children's sake, for appearances. Mary stared at him. A marriage of convenience, you mean? If that's what you want to call it. And what would that mean exactly? What would change? Thomas had thought about this during the long ride from Silverton. Legally everything. You'd be my wife, the children would be my stepchildren. They'd have my name, my protection, my inheritance when I'm gone. And personally, that would be up to us. Thomas met her eyes across the fire. I'm not asking you to love me, Mary. I'm asking you to let me take care of you and the children legally, officially. We could keep everything else the same as it is now. Mary was quiet for so long that Thomas began to think he'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe he'd misread the situation entirely. Maybe she was happy with the way things were and didn't want to complicate them with marriage, even a practical one. The children would like it, she said finally. Yes, I think they would. And you? What would you get out of it? Thomas looked at the sleeping children, then back at Mary's face in the firelight. A family, he said simply. Something I never thought I'd have again. Mary nodded slowly. When? When what? When would we do it? If we did it. Thomas felt his heart start to beat faster. As soon as we can arrange it, I suppose. Next time we go to town. All right, Mary said quietly. All right, yes, for the children's sake. For the children's sake, Thomas agreed. But as they sat there in the firelight, both of them knew they were lying. This wasn't just for the children's sake, and it wasn't just about appearances or propriety or what James Caldwell and the neighbors might think. This was about two lonely people who had found something worth fighting for in each other. This was about a man who had been hiding from life in the mountains and a woman who had been running from grief on the plains, and the family they had built together out of necessity that had become something real. This was about love, even if neither of them was quite ready to say the word out loud. The next morning, as they loaded up the sled for the final leg of their journey home, Grace climbed onto Thomas's lap and looked at him with her serious blue eyes. Thomas, she said, are you going to be our daddy now? Thomas glanced at Mary, who nodded slightly. Would you like that? He asked. Grace considered this with the gravity of someone making a very important decision. Will you read us stories? Yes. And help Mama when she's tired? Yes. And not go away? Thomas felt his throat tighten. No, sweetheart. I won't go away. Grace nodded solemnly. Then yes, I would like that very much. As they drove toward home, and it was home now, truly and completely, Thomas realized that somewhere in the space of a few weeks, his life had been completely transformed. He'd gone from being a man with no future to a man with more future than he knew what to do with. Behind him, He could hear Samuel explaining to Emma exactly how their new family was going to work, and Mary humming quietly as she held Grace. In front of him, the mountains stretched away toward their cabin, toward the life they were building together. 7 years of solitude had ended not with loneliness, but with laughter. And Thomas Brennan, who had once thought he was better off alone, couldn't imagine ever being alone again. The wedding took place on a crisp March morning in the small church in Silverton, with only the Reverend, his wife, and a few curious townspeople as witnesses. Mary wore her best dress, the one she'd been saving for special occasions, and Thomas had borrowed a proper suit from the hotel keeper. The children stood beside them, scrubbed and dressed in their finest clothes, which Mary had somehow managed to acquire during their stay in town. Emma held Grace's hand, and Samuel stood proudly next to Thomas, having been appointed official ring bearer, even though they didn't have rings to exchange. It was a simple ceremony, practical and brief. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Mary's cheek gently, and the children applauded as if they were at a celebration rather than a legal formality. James Caldwell attended, though his expressions suggested he was there more out of obligation than joy. After the ceremony, he approached them with stiff congratulations. "Well," he said to Mary, "I suppose this makes everything proper now." "Yes," Mary replied evenly, "I suppose it does." James looked like he wanted to say more, but one glance at Thomas's steady gaze seemed to change his mind. He wished them well and retreated to his store, and Thomas suspected they wouldn't be hearing from him again anytime soon. The ride home was different from their previous trips to town. There was an excitement in the air, a sense of celebration that even the winter landscape couldn't diminish. The children chattered about the wedding, about how fancy everything had been, about whether this meant they could call Thomas Papa now. "What do you think?" Thomas asked Grace, who was once again curled up between him and Mary on the sled's front seat. Grace considered this seriously. "I think," she said finally, "that Papa's what I called my first daddy. Maybe you could be something different." "What did you have in mind?" "How about Da?" Grace tried the word out, testing how it sounded. "Da. I like that." "Da it is," Thomas agreed, and felt something warm spread through his chest at the sound of it. That night, in the cabin that was now officially their family home, they celebrated with a special dinner. Thomas had splurged on a bottle of real wine in town, and Mary had made a cake from their precious store of sugar and flour. They ate by lamplight, laughing and talking about their plans for the future. After the children were asleep, Thomas and Mary sat by the fire, sharing the last of the wine and talking quietly. "So," Mary said, "we're married now." "Officially," Thomas agreed. "How do you feel about that?" Thomas considered the question. How did he feel? Relief, certainly. Pride, absolutely. But there was something else, something deeper and more complicated that he wasn't quite ready to examine. "Happy," he said finally. "I feel happy." Mary smiled. "Good, so do I." They were quiet for a moment, both of them aware that they were navigating new territory. They were married now, but what did that mean for them personally? They'd been careful to frame the marriage as a practical arrangement, but sitting here in the firelight, Thomas was finding it hard to think of it in purely practical terms. "Mary," he said carefully, "I want you to know that nothing has to change between us. I meant what I said about this being whatever you want it to be." Mary looked at him, her expression soft in the lamplight. "What if what I want is for things to change?" Thomas felt his heart skip. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Mary said, moving closer to him on the bench, "that maybe this doesn't have to be just a marriage of convenience. Maybe it could be more." Thomas stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Mary, I know it's complicated," she said quickly. "I know we didn't plan this. But Thomas, these past few weeks, I've been happier than I've been in years. Not just grateful, not just safe. Happy." "So have I," Thomas admitted. "Then why don't we see where this goes?" Mary reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "We're already a family in every way that matters. Why not be a family in this way too?" Thomas looked down at their joined hands, then up at Mary's face. She was beautiful in the firelight, but more than that, she was brave. Brave enough to suggest turning their practical arrangement into something real. Brave enough to risk her heart on a man who'd been hiding in the mountains for 7 years. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm sure," Mary said softly. "Are you?" Instead of answering with words, Thomas leaned forward and kissed her. Not the polite peck on the cheek from the wedding ceremony, but a real kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, Mary smiled. "I think that's a yes." The spring that followed was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. As the snow melted and the mountain valleys turned green, his life bloomed alongside the landscape. What had begun as a marriage of convenience slowly transformed into something deeper, richer, more real than either of them had dared to hope. The children thrived in their new environment. Emma threw herself into her studies with the determination of someone who understood that education was the key to a better future. Mary had been teaching her, but Thomas supplemented the lessons with practical knowledge: how to read the weather, how to identify edible plants, how to handle tools safely. Samuel became Thomas's shadow, following him everywhere and absorbing knowledge like a sponge. He learned to care for the animals, to split kindling, to help with the 100 small tasks that kept a mountain homestead running. His natural curiosity and eagerness to help made him the perfect apprentice. And Grace was the sunshine that made everything else possible. Her laughter filled the cabin, her endless questions kept everyone entertained, and her absolute confidence that this was how families were supposed to work made it impossible for anyone to doubt that they belonged together. As for Mary and Thomas, they discovered that their practical partnership was evolving into something neither of them had expected. They worked together during the day, planned together in the evenings, and gradually began to share the kind of intimacy that comes from truly knowing another person. It wasn't the passionate, overwhelming love of youth. It was something steadier, deeper. The love that grows from shared struggles and common goals, from watching someone care for your children as if they were their own, from finding that the person you married for practical reasons has become the person you can't imagine living without. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the children play in the yard, Mary turned to Thomas with a smile. "Do you know what I realized today?" she said. "What's that?" "I can't remember the last time I thought about this as temporary. When I plan dinner, I think about what you'll like. When I mend clothes, I darn your socks without even thinking about it. When Grace asks me about the future, I automatically include you in it." Thomas nodded. "I know what you mean. Yesterday I was thinking about expanding the stable, and I caught myself planning space for a pony for Grace." "A pony?" Mary laughed. "She'd love that." "Every little girl should have a pony," Thomas said solemnly, which made Mary laugh harder. "You're getting soft, Thomas Brennan." "Maybe," Thomas agreed, "but I like it." That night after the children were asleep, Thomas and Mary walked out to the place where he'd first heard Grace crying in the storm. The snow was long gone now, replaced by wildflowers and new grass. "It's hard to believe it was only a few months ago," Mary said, standing in the spot where her family had nearly died. "Best storm I ever weathered," Thomas said, putting his arm around her. Mary leaned into his embrace. "Thomas, can I tell you something?" "Anything." "When I knocked on your door that night, I thought I was just trying to save my children's lives. I never imagined I was also saving my own." Thomas kissed the top of her head. "You saved mine, too." As they stood there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the peace of the mountains and the sounds of their children's safe sleep, Thomas realized that his 7 years of solitude hadn't been a mistake. They'd been preparation. He'd needed that time alone to become the man who could appreciate what he'd been given, to understand the value of the family that had found him in the storm. "Mary," he said quietly, "I love you." It was the first time either of them had said the words, and they hung in the night air like a promise. Mary looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears. "I love you too." And there, in the place where their story had begun with desperation and fear, it continued with hope and love, and the absolute certainty that some families are born, but the best families are chosen. Summer brought challenges that tested the foundation of their newly formed family in ways none of them had anticipated. It started with a letter that arrived via a traveling merchant, a letter that would force them to confront the one aspect of their new life they hadn't fully considered. Thomas was working in the garden with Samuel when Mary appeared in the doorway, holding a piece of paper with a grim expression. "Thomas," she called, "we need to talk." He could tell from her tone that it wasn't good news. Setting down his hoe, he sent Samuel to help Emma with Grace and joined Mary inside the cabin. "What is it?" he asked. Mary handed him the letter. "It's from a lawyer in Denver about my late husband's estate." Thomas read the letter quickly, his frown deepening with each line. "They're saying there was a life insurance policy?" "Apparently," Mary's voice was tight. "One that David never told me about. The lawyer says I'm entitled to a significant sum of money." Thomas looked up from the letter. "That's good news, isn't it?" "Maybe, or maybe it's going to destroy everything we built." Mary sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "Thomas, if I have money of my own, really my own, then this marriage becomes a choice instead of a necessity," Thomas finished, understanding her concern. "Exactly." Mary looked at him with worried eyes. "What if people think I married you just to have someone to take care of me until I could claim my inheritance? What if they think you married me for the money?" Thomas set the letter aside and sat down across from her. "Do you care what people think?" "I care what you think. I care what the children think." Mary's voice was strained. "I don't want you to ever wonder if I stayed with you because I needed to or because I wanted to." Thomas reached across the table and took her hands. "Mary, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night about not wanting to be a charity case?" Mary nodded. "This is the same thing. You're not a charity case, and I'm not a convenience. We're married because we chose to be, and money doesn't change that." "But it changes everything else," Mary insisted. "With that money, I could buy a house in town, give the children proper schooling, make sure they have opportunities." "And you think they can't have those things here?" Mary hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe. But Thomas, what if this isn't enough for them? What if they need more than mountain life can give them?" It was a question that had been lurking in the back of Thomas's mind since the day they'd become a family. He loved these children as if they were his own blood, but he also wanted what was best for them. If that meant letting them go, the conversation was interrupted by Grace bursting through the door, tears streaming down her face. "Duh!" she sobbed, running straight to Thomas. "Emma said I'm stupid." Thomas scooped her up, settling her on his lap. "What happened, sweetheart?" Through her tears, Grace explained that Emma had been trying to teach her to read, and Grace had gotten frustrated with the difficult words. In her frustration, she'd thrown the book, and Emma had called her stupid. "Where's Emma now?" Mary asked gently. "In the loft," Grace sniffled. "She said she doesn't want to teach me anymore." Thomas and Mary exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of situation that made Mary's concerns about the children's education feel more pressing. "Grace," Thomas said gently, "learning is hard. It's supposed to be hard. That's how you know your brain is growing." "But I can't do it," Grace wailed. "The letters all look the same, and Emma knows so much more than me." "Emma is older than you," Mary pointed out. "When she was your age, she couldn't read either." "Really? Really? And you know what? You're going to learn to read and you're going to be wonderful at it, but it's going to take practice and patience." Thomas looked at his youngest daughter, because that's what Grace was now, his daughter, and made a decision. "How about this?" he said. "What if we set up a real school, right here in the cabin? Emma can be the teacher sometimes, and Mama can be the teacher sometimes, and I can teach you about mountain things." Grace's eyes lit up. "My own school?" "Your own school," Thomas confirmed. Over the next few weeks, Thomas threw himself into creating what he privately called the Mountain Academy. He built proper desks for the children, bought slate boards and chalk from town, and even acquired a small collection of books suitable for different reading levels. Mary, meanwhile, had written to the lawyer in Denver, asking for more information about the insurance policy. When his response came, it confirmed their hopes and fears in equal measure. The policy was legitimate, and the sum was indeed significant, enough to buy a house in Denver or to fund the children's education at proper schools. "We have to think about their futures," Mary said one evening as they discussed their options. "Emma is bright enough to become a teacher herself, or even more. Samuel has a natural curiosity that could take him into science or engineering. And Grace has so much potential. And you think they can't reach that potential here? Mary looked around their cabin, at the children bent over their homework at the kitchen table, at the life they'd built together in the mountains. I think, she said carefully, that we need to make sure we're not limiting them because we're comfortable here. It was Emma who inadvertently settled the question. A week later, she approached Thomas and Mary with a serious expression and a carefully written proposal. I've been thinking, she said, about school and learning and everything. And, Mary prompted. I want to stay here, Emma said firmly. I know you've been talking about the money and whether we should move to the city, and I want you to know that I don't want to go. Thomas and Mary exchanged surprised glances. Emma, Mary said gently, in the city you could go to a real school with trained teachers and other children your age. I don't want other children my age, Emma interrupted. I want my family. I want to wake up in the mountains and help Da with the animals and learn from you and take care of Grace and Samuel. But sweetheart, there are opportunities in the city that you can't have here. Emma's expression grew stubborn, an expression Thomas was beginning to recognize as a family trait. What if we brought the opportunities here? Emma asked. What if we used the money to make this place better instead of leaving for someplace else? What do you mean? Thomas asked, intrigued. Emma pulled out a piece of paper covered with her careful handwriting. I made a list. We could use the money to buy more books and maybe pay a real teacher to come up here sometimes. We could fix up the cabin, make it bigger so other families could visit and their children could learn with us. We could buy better tools for Da and maybe some animals and... She continued reading her list, and Thomas felt his heart swell with pride. This 8-year-old girl had not only thought seriously about her future, she'd found a way to envision it that included everyone she loved. Emma, Mary said softly, these are wonderful ideas, but are you sure you wouldn't rather live in town? With proper shops and neighbors and... Mama, Emma said, before we came here, when were you happiest? Mary blinked, clearly not expecting the question. What do you mean? In our old house or here? Mary looked around the cabin, at Thomas, at the children who were watching this conversation with intense interest. Here, she said quietly. I've been happiest here. Me too, Samuel chimed in. I don't want to live in town. I want to stay with Da and the chickens. Grace nodded vigorously. The mountains are home. That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Mary sat up late talking about Emma's proposal and what it would mean for their family. She's right, you know, Mary said, about the opportunities. We could create something special here, a place where children learn not just from books, but from life. It wouldn't be easy, Thomas warned. Mountain life never is. Nothing worthwhile ever is. Mary leaned against his shoulder. But Thomas, if we do this, we do it together. Really together, as equal partners. What do you mean? I mean the insurance money doesn't go into my account or your account. It goes into our account. For our family, for our future. No matter what happens, we're in this together. Thomas felt something tight in his chest loosen. He'd been worried, though he hadn't admitted it even to himself, that the money would change things between them, that Mary would feel she didn't need him anymore, or that he would feel like he hadn't earned his place in her life. Together, he agreed. 6 months later, the Brennan family had transformed their mountain homestead into something unique in the Colorado Territory. They'd used Mary's inheritance to expand the cabin, adding proper bedrooms and a dedicated schoolroom. They'd bought more animals, better tools, and enough books to stock a small library. More importantly, they'd started taking in other children during the summer months, the sons and daughters of miners and ranchers who wanted their children to have education but couldn't send them to distant schools. Emma had become a genuine teacher's assistant, helping younger children with their letters while Mary taught mathematics and literature. Samuel had discovered a talent for natural sciences, collecting specimens and keeping detailed observations of wildlife and weather patterns. Grace, now 5 and reading simple books, had appointed herself the official welcoming committee for new students. And Thomas had found that his years of solitary mountain living had prepared him to teach things that no city school could offer: self-reliance, practical skills, and the kind of deep observation that comes from living close to the natural world. One evening in late summer, as they sat on their expanded porch watching a group of visiting children play in the yard, Mary turned to Thomas with a satisfied smile. "Do you know what I realized today?" she said. "What's that?" "I used to think that being a good mother meant giving my children everything I never had. But it turns out being a good mother means giving them exactly what they need, even if it's not what I expected." Thomas watched Emma patiently helping a 6-year-old boy sound out words while Samuel showed a group of children how to identify different types of rocks. Grace was organizing an elaborate game that seemed to involve both education and entertainment. "They're going to be extraordinary," he said quietly. "They already are," Mary replied. "We all are." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Thomas reflected on how much had changed since that stormy night when 4 desperate strangers had knocked on his door. They'd all been running from something then: Mary from poverty and uncertainty, the children from loss and upheaval, and Thomas from the isolation he'd thought was safety. Now they weren't running from anything. They were running toward something, toward a future they were building together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. "Mary," Thomas said as the stars began to appear, "thank you." "For what?" "For knocking on my door, for trusting me with your children, for building this life with me." Mary took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Thank you for opening it." In the distance, a coyote howled, and somewhere closer, an owl answered. The mountains were settling into their evening quiet, but the Brennan house remained full of gentle sounds. Children's laughter, the soft murmur of bedtime stories, the creak of settling wood. It was the sound of home, the sound of family, the sound of love that had grown from necessity into something deeper and more lasting than either Mary or Thomas had ever dared to dream. 5 years had passed since the storm that changed everything, and the Brennan Mountain Academy had become something of a legend throughout the Colorado Territory. Families traveled from as far as Denver to bring their children to spend summers learning from Thomas and Mary, and several education officials had visited to study their unique approach to frontier schooling. Emma, now 13, had grown into a remarkable young woman with her mother's quiet strength and her stepfather's practical wisdom. She'd begun corresponding with teachers in Denver and Boulder, sharing teaching methods and learning new ones. There was already talk of her attending the new Teachers College in Denver when she turned 16, though she insisted she'd be coming back to the mountains to teach. Samuel, at 11, had developed into a young naturalist whose detailed observations of mountain wildlife had caught the attention of scientists at the university. His notebooks filled shelf after shelf, documenting everything from migration patterns to seasonal changes in vegetation. He'd also become Thomas's invaluable partner in all aspects of running the homestead. Grace, now 9, had indeed learned to read wonderfully and had discovered a talent for storytelling that kept both visiting children and her own family entertained for hours. She'd begun writing down the stories Thomas told about his years alone in the mountains, creating what she called The Adventures of the Lonely Woodsman. And Mary had bloomed in ways that still surprised Thomas. She'd discovered gifts for teaching and organization that had made their mountain school a success. More than that, she'd grown into a confident, capable woman who managed their complex household with grace and humor. As for Thomas himself, he sometimes felt like he was living someone else's life, someone much luckier and wiser than the man who'd been hiding in these mountains 7 years ago. The lonely woodsman had become a husband, father, teacher, and pillar of his community. On a crisp October morning, as the aspen trees painted the mountainsides gold and red, Thomas was working in his workshop when Emma appeared in the doorway. "Da," she said, "could I talk to you about something?" Thomas set down his plane and gave her his full attention. Emma's somethings were usually worth listening to. "What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about the future," Emma said, settling onto a stool near his workbench. "About what I want to do with my life. And I want to be a teacher, a real teacher with proper training, but I also want to come back here and help you and Mama build something even bigger." Thomas nodded, not surprised. Emma had been talking about teaching for months. I've been writing to Miss Patterson at the Teachers College, Emma continued, and she says I could probably start classes next year if I wanted. But I'm scared. Of what? Emma's usually confident expression faltered slightly. Of leaving here. Of leaving all of you. What if I go to Denver and discover I don't belong in the city? What if I come back and don't belong here anymore either? Thomas understood the fear. He'd felt something similar when he'd first started thinking about sharing his mountain solitude with Mary and the children. Emma, he said gently, do you know what I was doing the day your mama knocked on my door? Living alone, Emma said. Being the lonely woodsman. I was hiding, Thomas corrected. I was so afraid of losing people I cared about that I'd decided not to care about anyone at all. And you know what I discovered? What? That hiding from life isn't the same as living it. When your mom and you children came here, you didn't just save me from the storm. You saved me from wasting the rest of my life being afraid. Emma was quiet considering his words. Going to Denver won't change who you are, Thomas continued. It'll just add to who you are. And no matter how much you learn or how far you travel, this will always be your home. We will always be your family. Promise? I promise, Thomas smiled at her. Besides, someone has to carry on the Brennan Mountain Academy tradition. Samuel's going to be too busy studying bugs, and Grace is going to be too busy writing stories about all of us. Emma laughed, the tension leaving her shoulders. Speaking of Grace's stories, have you read the latest one? Not yet. What's it about? It's called The Day the Lonely Woodsman Stopped Being Lonely. It's about us, about that first night. Thomas felt his throat tighten slightly. Is it good? It's beautiful, Emma said softly. She writes about how sometimes the best families are the ones that find each other in storms. Their conversation was interrupted by Samuel bursting into the workshop, his face flushed with excitement. Emma, come quick. Mama says we have visitors coming up the mountain road. Thomas and Emma exchanged glances and hurried outside. Sure enough, a wagon was making its way up the winding trail toward their homestead, moving slowly in the afternoon heat. Expecting anyone? Thomas asked Mary, who was shading her eyes with her hand as she watched the approaching wagon. No, Mary replied, but it looks like a family. There are children in the wagon bed. As the wagon drew closer, they could see it was indeed a family. A man and woman on the driver's seat, with what looked like 3 or 4 children visible in the back. The wagon was loaded with household goods and the horses looked tired from the climb. They look like they're traveling, Emma observed. Maybe they're lost? The wagon pulled up in front of the cabin, and the man tipped his hat politely. He was middle-aged with work-worn hands and the lean build of someone accustomed to hard labor. The woman beside him looked exhausted, and the children in the back of the wagon were dusty and wide-eyed. Afternoon, the man called. Name's Robert Harrison. This here's my wife Catherine and our children. We're heading to Silver Creek, but our navigator seems to have gotten us turned around. Thomas stepped forward. You're about 15 miles off course. Silver Creek's that way. He pointed northwest. But it's getting late in the day. You won't make it before dark, and these mountain roads aren't safe to travel at night. Robert Harrison looked at the setting sun, then at his tired family. I was afraid of that. Is there a place in these parts where we might camp for the night? Mary stepped up beside Thomas. You're welcome to stay here, she said without hesitation. We have room and supper's almost ready. Oh no, ma'am, Catherine Harrison said quickly. We couldn't impose. We have our bedrolls and we're used to camping. Nonsense, Mary replied firmly. The nights are getting cold and those children look tired. Thomas, help Mr. Harrison with his horses. As the Harrison family settled in for the evening, Thomas found himself watching the scene with a sense of déjà vu. Here was another family worn down by travel and circumstance, finding shelter at their table. The Harrison children, 2 boys and 2 girls ranging in age from about 4 to 12, were soon chattering with Emma, Samuel, and Grace as if they'd known each other for years. Over dinner, the Harrisons shared their story. Robert had been a farmer in Kansas until drought and grasshoppers destroyed 3 years' worth of crops. Like so many others, they'd loaded everything they owned into a wagon and headed west, hoping to start over in Colorado territory. It's a hard thing, Robert said quietly, leaving everything you know behind. But sometimes you don't have a choice. Thomas and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. They understood that feeling all too well. What kind of work are you looking for in Silver Creek? Thomas asked. Anything honest, Robert replied. I can farm, but I'm handy with tools too. Catherine's a fine seamstress, and our oldest boy Jake is strong for his age. Jobs are scarce in Silver Creek, Thomas said thoughtfully. Most of the good land's already taken, and the mine's not hiring. Robert's face fell slightly. Well, we'll make do somehow. We always have. Later that evening, after the Harrison children had been bedded down in the main room and the adults were sitting on the porch, Emma approached Thomas with a suggestion. She said quietly. I've been thinking about what Mr. Harrison said, about looking for work. What about it? Well, you've been saying we need help with the academy. More students mean more work, and you and Mom are already stretched thin. What if the Harrisons stayed here? Thomas raised an eyebrow. Stayed here? Emma, we don't have room for another family. We could build another cabin, Emma said eagerly. Mr. Harrison knows construction, and you could use the help with all the projects you've been planning. Mrs. Harrison could help Mama with the teaching and the sewing, and their children would add to our school. Samuel, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. I like that idea. Jake knows a lot about farming, and the little ones are fun to play with. Even Grace appeared, rubbing sleepy eyes. Can they stay, Da? I want to show Molly my storybooks. Thomas looked at his children, then at Mary, who was smiling softly. It's a big decision, Mary said, but Emma has a point. We've been talking about expanding, and it would be nice to have neighbors who are also friends. The next morning, Thomas took Robert aside and made his proposition. The relief and gratitude on the man's face was answer enough. You'd really do that? Robert asked. Give us a place to stay, work to do? We don't have much to offer in return. You have exactly what we need, Thomas replied. Willing hands, good hearts, and children who could grow up alongside ours. That's worth more than money. Over the following months, the mountain community grew. Robert proved to be an excellent carpenter and a natural teacher of practical skills. Catherine's gentle manner and education background made her a perfect addition to the academy's teaching staff. Their children integrated seamlessly into the Brennan family dynamic, creating a larger, more vibrant household. By winter, a second cabin had been built just 100 yards from the original, connected by a covered walkway that the children had dubbed the bridge. The two families shared meals, chores, and the education of their children in a way that felt natural and right. One snowy evening in December, as both families gathered around the fire in the main cabin, Grace stood up with a new story to read. This one's called The Day the Lonely Woodsman Found More Family, she announced. As she read her tale about families growing and changing and making room for more love, Thomas looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight. Emma and Jake Harrison bent over a mathematics problem together. Samuel and the younger Harrison boy were building something elaborate with wooden blocks. Mary and Catherine were quietly discussing lesson plans for the coming week. Robert was carving a toy horse for one of the littlest ones. This was what they'd built. Not just a school, not just a business, but a true community. A place where families could grow and thrive and take care of each other. Grace said when she finished her story. Do you think there will be more families? What do you mean, sweetheart? Will other families come here like we did? Like the Harrisons did? Will our family keep growing? Thomas looked at Mary, who nodded encouragingly. I think, Thomas said, that families have a way of finding each other when they need to. And I think our mountain is big enough for as many families as want to call it home. Good, Grace said with satisfaction, because I like having lots of people to tell stories to. That night, as Thomas and Mary prepared for bed in their room, they could hear the gentle sounds of their expanded household settling for the night. Children's whispered conversations in the loft, Robert banking the fire in the Harrison cabin, Catherine singing a soft lullaby to her youngest. Do you ever miss it? Mary asked quietly. The quiet? The simplicity of when it was just us? Thomas considered the question seriously. Sometimes, he admitted, but then I think about Emma teaching Jake to read, or Samuel showing the Harrison boys how to track animals, or Grace organizing elaborate games that include everyone. And I realized that this is what we were meant to build. A community, a family, Thomas corrected. A very large, very loud, very loving family. Mary smiled and settled against his shoulder. I love you, Thomas Brennan. I love you too, Mary Brennan, all of you. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of winter storms to come. But inside the two cabins that now made up the Brennan homestead, 13 people slept peacefully, safe in the knowledge that they belonged to each other and to this place they'd made together. The lonely woodsman was no longer alone. In fact, he was beginning to think he might never be alone again. And for the first time in his life, that thought didn't frighten him at all. As the years passed, more families would find their way to the mountain. Some would stay, some would move on, but all would be welcomed with the same spirit that had first opened Thomas's door to a desperate mother and her 3 children on a stormy night. Because they'd learned the most important lesson of all, that love grows when it's shared, that families are built one act of kindness at a time, and that sometimes the most extraordinary things begin with the simple courage to open your door when someone needs shelter from the storm. Years turned into decades, and the Brennan Mountain Academy became more than just a school. It became a beacon of hope for families seeking new beginnings. Emma did go to Teachers College in Denver, returning with new knowledge and innovative teaching methods that made their mountain school even more renowned. She eventually married Jake Harrison, and together they expanded the educational opportunities for children throughout the territory. Samuel's naturalist observations contributed to scientific journals and helped establish some of the first conservation efforts in Colorado. His detailed documentation of wildlife patterns and seasonal changes became invaluable resources for researchers and settlers alike. He married a fellow scientist who came to study the mountain ecosystem, and they raised their children with the same respect for nature that Thomas had taught him. Grace became a celebrated author whose stories about frontier families touch readers across the nation. Her tales of the Brennan family and their mountain community inspired countless others to open their doors to those in need. She never married, claiming that she was too busy collecting stories from all the families who found their way to the mountain. As for Thomas and Mary, they lived out their days surrounded by children, their own, their students, their adopted strays, and eventually their grandchildren. The original cabin expanded over the years into a complex of buildings that housed multiple families, but it never lost the warmth that had first welcomed a desperate widow and her 3 children on a stormy night. When Thomas finally passed away at the age of 78, the entire territory mourned. But his legacy lived on in every family that had found refuge at his table, in every child who had learned not just reading and arithmetic, but kindness and courage from his example, and in the mountain community that continued to welcome strangers and turn them into family. Mary lived another 10 years after Thomas, continuing to teach and guide the ever-growing community they had built together. When she joined him in the small cemetery behind the original cabin, their headstone bore a simple inscription: "They opened their door to strangers and found their family." The lonely woodsman was lonely no more. And there it is, folks. The story of how 3 children, one desperate mother, and a man who thought he'd live alone forever became something none of them ever expected. A family that would grow and change and welcome others for generations to come. The Brennan Mountain Academy became a legend in Colorado territory, sending young people out into the world with both book learning and mountain wisdom. Emma did become that teacher she dreamed of being, expanding the school until it was recognized throughout the territory. Samuel's detailed observations of Rocky Mountain wildlife contributed to our understanding of nature that scientists still reference today. And Grace? Well, Grace became a storyteller whose tales of frontier families touched hearts across the nation. But perhaps the most important legacy of Thomas and Mary Brennan was this: they proved that the best families aren't always the ones we're born into, but the ones we choose to build. They showed that love multiplies when it's shared, that kindness is never wasted, and that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives begin with the simple courage to open a door when someone knocks. Their mountain homestead continued to welcome families for decades. Some stayed and became part of the growing community. Others moved on to build their own dreams elsewhere. but all carried with them the lesson that home isn't just a place, it's the people who make you feel like you belong. The cabin where it all began still stands today, weathered by countless storms but strong as ever. Local folks say that on quiet winter nights, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the pines, you can still see a light burning in the window, a beacon for anyone who might be lost in the darkness, looking for shelter, looking for home. Because Thomas and Mary Brennan understood something that the world desperately needs to remember, that we all have the power to change someone's life. We all have doors we can open, tables where we can make room for one more, hearts with space to expand. The question isn't whether we have enough to share, it's whether we have the courage to share what we have. In a world that can feel cold and divided, where people build walls instead of bridges, where fear makes us turn away from those who need help most, the Brennan family reminds us that there's another way. They remind us that sometimes the most extraordinary families begin with the most ordinary acts of kindness, that sometimes saving someone else is exactly what we need to save ourselves. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. What storms are raging in your life right now? What doors have you been keeping closed out of fear, out of convenience, out of the simple assumption that your problems are already big enough without taking on someone else's? And maybe most importantly, when someone knocks on your door, desperate and afraid, carrying nothing but need and hope, will you have the courage to be like Thomas Brennan? Will you choose to see not an inconvenience, but an opportunity? Will you discover that the family you never knew you needed might just arrive in the middle of the worst storm of your life? Because here's what Thomas and Mary learned, and what their story teaches us all. The lonely don't have to stay lonely, not when there are still people in this world willing to share their fire with those who've lost their way in the cold. Not when there are still hearts big enough to make room for strangers who might become family. Not when there are still those who understand that the best way to heal from your own wounds is to help bind up someone else's. The mountains of Colorado still stand today, snow-capped and eternal, guardians of countless stories of survival and love and second chances. And if you listen carefully on a quiet winter night, you might still hear the echo of it all. Children's laughter, the sound of stories being told around a crackling fire, and the voices of families who found each other when they needed it most. So what do you say? Are you ready to stop being the lonely woodsman? Are you ready to open your door and discover what family might be waiting just outside, lost in the storm? If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that families come in all shapes and sizes, if it made you believe that kindness still matters in this world, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of courage, love, and the families we build along the way. Because out here on the frontier, whether it's 1887 or 2024, the most important truth remains the same. We're all just looking for home, and sometimes home finds us when we least expect it and need it most. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright and your doors ready to open. You never know what family might be waiting just outside in the storm. This has been Wild West Stories. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the best families are the ones that find each other in the snow.